Stop waiting for prices to go back to normal. It is never going to happen. You have been sold a comforting lie called transitory inflation, but the arithmetic reality of the global debt spiral makes deflation an impossibility. They aren't fighting inflation. They are meticulously managing the exact velocity of capital erosion to sustain the systemic illusion. Today, Macro Threshold is pulling back the curtain on the Federal Reserve's actual playbook to show you why the cost of living is structurally designed to rise forever, and why your savings are being burned as fuel to keep their apparatus from collapsing. This is the evidence they hope you never examine. This is the era of collapse. We operate at the intersection of fear and necessity, where the palpable anxiety over diminishing purchasing power meets the critical need for strategic knowledge. We are here to expose the elite's silent exit strategy from the colossal debt conundrum they engineered, revealing the truth behind the shredded veil of monetary mandates that once promised stability. The foundational principle we must internalize is that inflation is no longer a policy miscalculation, a temporary side effect of supply chain disruptions, or the result of a single global conflict. It is the core engine of systemic survival. We are witnessing the irreversible calibration of price floors, defining an economic new normal where persistent, corrosive price increases are the desired outcome. The illusion maintained by central bankers is that they are aiming for a mere 2% annual inflation target, a number that is itself arbitrary and economically violent. But the operational reality demonstrates that anything less than 3 to 4% threatens to expose the insolvency that underpins the sovereign debt structure. The primary function of the current monetary policy apparatus is not to preserve the value of the currency or secure the welfare of the citizenry, but to ensure that the accumulated staggering level of public and private debt remains serviceable and eventually affordable through slow-motion dilution. This required debasement generates the expanding wealth chasm we experience every day, visible in the stark comparison between the officially published consumer price index baskets and the stagnant median wage growth. While the official statistics attempt to minimize the impact of inflation by adjusting calculations through hedonic measures and substitutions, masking the true cost escalation in non-discretionary necessities. The reality for the median household is inescapable. The purchasing power needed to secure housing, energy, and education is rising at rates far exceeding any increase in their earned income. Their economic ladder is not just stalled, the rungs are actively being pulled away by the central planning apparatus. This economic environment is not unique to the 21st century. It is simply the latest iteration of the secular central bank playbook, a tripartite model of debasement employed by every ruling regime facing insurmountable over-indebtedness throughout history. We can identify 3 pivotal historical junctures where the ruling structure explicitly chose currency devaluation to resolve sovereign insolvency. The ancient precursor is perhaps the most illustrative in its sheer physical transparency, the coinage debasement practiced by the Roman Empire. When imperial expenditure exceeded tax revenue and the legions demanded more silver than the mines could produce, the solution was not fiscal discipline, but the systematic reduction of the metallic content within the denarius. Starting as a pure silver coin, its content was steadily diluted with base metals until, by the 3rd century AD, the official Roman currency was nothing more than a copper slug with a thin wash of silver. The masses saw the coin, but the intrinsic value was meticulously destroyed by the state, forcing citizens to pay taxes and transact using what was essentially governmental promissory paper, disguised as money. This was an ancient tax on every single productive act, a silent seizure of wealth required to sustain an empire that had become too large and too expensive to afford. Fast forward millennia, and the second crucial juncture is the 1971 Nixon shock, the final and total severing of the dollar's link to gold. This monumental decision completed from a system constrained by physical scarcity to a pure fiat architecture constrained only by political will and the printing press. Prior to 1971, the debt spiral was limited by the need to maintain some semblance of dollar convertibility for foreign governments. Once that constraint was removed, the quantitative expansion of credit became the primary tool of economic management, setting the ultimate stage for the debt catastrophe we face today. This act established the framework that allowed debt to grow without any corresponding physical anchor, transforming the currency into a purely elastic liability management tool that could be expanded infinitely, provided public confidence did not break. The final modern component of this debasement model emerged in the post-2008 debt crisis. This period saw the normalization of infinite quantitative easing, establishing the modern precedent that the central bank AS balance sheet serves as the ultimate backstop for the entire global financial system. When the credit structure seized, the Federal Reserve intervened not merely to stabilize short-term liquidity, but to fundamentally alter the perception of risk by monetizing trillions of dollars of distressed assets. This action demonstrated that the stability of the banking system and the continuity of the government's borrowing capability superseded any historic mandate concerning price stability. QE established the psychological and operational baseline for today's environment. In the face of crisis, central banks will always choose dilution over default, sacrificing the value of the currency to preserve the structure of the debt. Every financial crisis since 2008 has been met with a larger, faster injection of liquidity, fundamentally proving that the central bank's true mandate is system solvency through managed inflation, not currency preservation. This history leads us to the grim conclusion that the fiat currency collapse is an arithmetic certainty, not a theoretical possibility. The global debt to GDP ratio has reached levels that mathematically preclude traditional repayment mechanisms. When sovereign debt vastly outstrips the productive capacity of the underlying economy, there are only three historical outcomes: default, war, or dilution. Because outright default is catastrophic for the banking sector that holds this debt, and war is risky and politically unpredictable, currency depreciation, monetary dilution, is chosen as the sole viable, controllable mechanism to service this insurmountable debt load. The explosion in the M2 money supply, particularly evident since the pandemic response, serves as definitive proof of this slow, intentional capital destruction. The M2 metric tracks the total amount of currency in circulation, plus easily convertible near money assets. And its parabolic trajectory over the last decade demonstrates a commitment to monetary expansion that is wholly disconnected from organic economic growth. This expansion is designed to facilitate the servicing of debt with cheaper, diluted future dollars. Coupled with the geometric expansion of the money supply is the structural necessity of maintaining negative real interest rates. A negative real rate means the nominal interest rate on deposits or safe assets is lower than the actual rate of inflation. A negative real rate means the nominal interest rate on deposits or safe assets is lower than the actual rate of inflation. This disparity is not merely a policy failure, it is a structural mechanism for the silent transfer of wealth. If inflation runs at 8% and the interest you earn on your savings or treasury bonds is 2%, you are losing 6% of your purchasing power annually, a guaranteed destruction of stored capital. This is the necessary subsidy provided by savers to the debtors, the largest of which is the state itself. The system uses your accumulated wealth as a massive passive buffer against default. This wealth erosion is the hidden tax on systemic stability, preventing the debt spiral from mathematically collapsing by gradually destroying the intrinsic value of the currency used to pay it back. We must recognize that the central bank is not operating as a guardian of monetary value. It is functioning as the ultimate manager of controlled decay. This intentional slow burn is the arithmetic certainty derived from a global debt to GDP ratio that is so massive it cannot possibly be paid back in sound currency. Any attempt to enforce sound money principles now would trigger an immediate, catastrophic default across nearly every major developed economy. Since the political and banking elite refuse that outcome, the inflationary debasement timeline is locked in. This trajectory of controlled decay requires sophisticated, subtle management, often involving strategic deception regarding policy goals. Having established the fundamental why, the necessity of debt monetization, we must now pivot to the how. We need to deconstruct the Federal Reserve OS near-term playbook, the catastrophe timeline of misery management designed to sustain the systemic illusion just long enough for the debt to be fully inflated away. This playbook unfolds across four distinct phases, each characterized by increasing structural dishonesty. The first involves the careful theater of monetary policy, maintaining rate stability, or more accurately, maintaining the optics of fighting inflation. The Fed raises rates just enough to signal resolve and combat public panic, but critically never high enough to actually induce the necessary recessionary pain required to structurally rebalance the economy, or more importantly, raise the government's borrowing costs to a politically unsustainable level. They engage in a choreographed dance of hawkish rhetoric and minor quantitative tightening, creating the illusion of vigilance, while sovereign debt quietly continues to escalate exponentially behind the scenes, subsidized by cheap short-term funding and the suppressed long end of the bond market. The key operational goal of this S simply to buy time and suppress volatility while giving the public the comforting lie that the central bank is in control and prioritizing price stability. As the cost of debt service inevitably swells and fiscal pressures mount, the second is engineering narratives to justify unsustainable fiscal deficits. When the government finds itself incapable of funding its expansive spending obligations purely through taxation and conventional borrowing, massive structural deficits become a fixture. The central banking apparatus and coordinated media organs begin a unified effort to engineer compelling public narratives. The focus shifts entirely away from the underlying structural requirement for deficit spending, the need to keep the economy moving and avoid the debt ceiling crisis, and instead blames external factors. These narratives invariably pin the blame on geopolitical conflicts, the lingering effects of supply chain anomalies, or, most popularly, phantom corporate greed. Anything and everything except the monetary and fiscal mismanagement that created the imbalance. The goal of this S to condition the public to accept massive permanent government spending as an unavoidable, even desirable necessity, thereby providing political cover for the endless creation of new sovereign debt which the central bank is then structurally required to monetize to prevent a market seizing up. The third S, the unavoidable moment of truth, the eventual and forced pivot. This occurs when the annual interest payments on the cumulative national debt exceed a critical political and economic threshold, threatening to cannibalize nearly all discretionary spending or necessitate a primary default on U.S. obligations. At this point, the political expediency of maintaining the illusion of fighting inflation collapses completely. The Fed will be forced to reverse course violently, abandoning its hawkish stance and returning rapidly to the mechanisms of aggressive quantitative easing 2.0. Coupled with structural low interest rates, regardless of the published inflation statistics at the time. This pivot is not a policy choice debated among academic economists. It is a mechanical requirement to circumvent the instantaneous, system-ending catastrophe of sovereign default. The short-term pain of higher, sustained inflation is deemed by the ruling apparatus to be infinitely preferable to the immediate systemic collapse that defaulting on U.S. debt would entail. They recognize the binary constraint. They will print money on demand to fund the government's obligations, or the global financial architecture ends. The third option, austerity and sound money, is politically dead. The final and conclusive phase of the timeline is the public normalization and acceptance of permanently high inflation. Once the pivot is executed and the quantitative easing machinery is running at full tilt, the central bank cannot credibly promise a return to the long-desired 2% inflation target without triggering a recession so deep it would lead to politically ruinous austerity and potential civil unrest. Therefore, the fourth S, the gradual strategic shift in goalposts. Policymakers and aligned media organs begin subtly conditioning the public to accept a new inflationary baseline, where 5% to 7% annual price erosion is framed as the systemic new target. This higher baseline inflation rate is not random. It is the required velocity of capital destruction necessary to inflate away the staggering national debt burden over a multi-decade timeframe. They will market this devaluation as necessary for full employment or economic stability, effectively defining the impoverishment of the saving class as a national economic virtue. The lie of transitory inflation will be replaced by the lie of necessary inflation. If this established timeline is mathematically locked, driven by the structural reality of insurmountable debt, then the focus shifts entirely from prediction to strategic allocation. This realization strips away the comfort of relying on traditional financial instruments or passive savings. We're not merely facing a temporary cyclical challenge. We are living through the deliberate, controlled demolition of purchasing power as the ultimate systemic survival mechanism. The crucial debate is no longer about predicting whether the next recession will be shallow or deep. It is about strategic allocation and personal defense. If relentless, structurally mandated inflation is the unavoidable tax we must pay to prevent the instantaneous systemic collapse of the global debt apparatus, then what is your personal strategy for wealth preservation? This question defines the era. How do you, the individual investor or saver, hedge against the intentional destruction of your monetary unit? Does capital flow into hard, non-sovereign assets that cannot be printed, such as commodities or strategically important real estate? Does it flow into real productive capacity? Or is there an argument for strategically leveraged debt to defeat the inflation tax? The time for passive participation in this rigged game is over.